I first got on the internet in the late 1990s. I was pretty naive at the time, as I assume many of us were. I was so overwhelmed by the amount of people I met and the supposed friends that I made. I was 16 years old, and I was really at odds with my parents at the time. That was when I began talking to a girl who lived in California, though we never had any sort of romantic talking. We became what I believed were really good friends. I told her a lot about what was going on in my life, and a couple of weeks after we'd begun talking, she told me that if I ever needed a place to live, I could come and stay with her. Well, I took her completely seriously, so I decided to just up and leave in the middle of the night one night and take the Greyhound all the way to California. I didn't have much money, but there was enough to get me to where I was going. After the nearly 4-day trip across the country, when I got to the station, she was nowhere to be seen. I tried calling her and there was no answer either. I thought maybe she was just on her way to pick me up, but I waited and I called and I waited and called again. I soon came to the realization she was never going to come and get me. Because I believed someone that I didn't know, I ended up in a city that I knew nothing about, with no money, family, or friends. I wasn't sure what to do. It's not like I could just call my parents. I know a lot of you probably think that I could, but they would have told me that I made the mess and I would have to find my own way out of it. I spent as much time as I could in the bus station, but my time soon ran out when I was asked by a security guard to show my bus ticket. Of course, I didn't have one, so I was forced to leave soon after. I had to wander around LA on my own. I think most people would be surprised at the things you would do when you have no money and no way to get food or shelter. Your qualms about taking food out of the garbage go away very quickly, as do your cares about breaking into abandoned buildings in order to find a place to sleep. Yeah, I was naive and somewhat stupid for going to California in the first place. But I also found myself to be extremely trusting of other people that I didn't know. After about a week of sleeping on the streets trying to find some sort of runaway shelter and failing, I was sleeping in an alleyway. Something suddenly woke me up. It moved my leg a little bit. I was briefly aware of the sensation, but then I felt it again. This was definitely someone kicking me lightly on the side of the leg. When I woke up, there was a rather large man standing right next to me. Startled, I jumped up and was about to run away when the man stopped me and told me he was not a cop and he wasn't going to hurt me or anything either. He told me that he'd noticed me sleeping in the alley and wondered if he could get me a bite to eat or perhaps give me a place to sleep for just one night. Well, as you can imagine, I was eager for both, so I agreed. He took me to a fast food restaurant and let me order a ton of food. I scarfed it all down while he talked to me about my situation. I don't know how much of it I was actually paying attention to. It just felt so good to be getting some hot food in me. He then loaded me up in his car and told me he'd find me a safe place to sleep for the night. I honestly thought this meant he would be taking me to a motel or something. He didn't though. He took me to a house outside the city. It looked like it was abandoned or something. The lawn was obviously uncared for, the place was not kept up at all either. I recall the windows being boarded up as well. Still, I didn't think too much about it. I'd slept in many different abandoned buildings over the past week, so having another one was no big deal. The man opened the door, which was not unlocked, and he let me walk first into the building. It was dark, and he made no moves to turn on the light. He walked over to a door and told me I could sleep in that room. I didn't know how to respond really. I looked into the doorway and saw it wasn't a room at all. In fact, it was a staircase leading downward into the darkness. For the very first time, I paused. When I did so, the jerk grabbed me from behind and shoved me down the stairs. I fell hard all the way down to the bottom. As I did, I heard him close and lock the door behind me. A few moments later, I heard his car start up and he drove away. This was certainly an odd situation. I was homeless, And even though I was locked in a room, at least I was not outside in the cold. I'd also been put in this place against my will, though. I explored the room. There was nothing in there. No food, no water, no bed, no blanket. It was just a completely empty basement, with a single window that was too high up on the wall for me to reach it. I decided to sleep and just waited out and see what the guy was planning. He didn't come back right away, though. In fact, I fell asleep and was woken up in the morning by the sun shining down through that window. He didn't come back that day. He didn't come back that night either. He didn't come back the following day or the following night. At this point, I was beginning to get really scared. Yeah, I was hungry, but the thing I was most worried about was water. I knew I couldn't survive much longer without it. I was going to die of dehydration, which is an agonizing way to die. Another day passed, and I felt myself getting weaker, like I would die at any moment. I had gone almost 3 full days without any water. I had been told before that 3 full days was the maximum amount before you couldn't live any longer. I didn't die yet, but I felt so sick and wonky that I couldn't even get up. I was falling in and out of sleep for who knows how long. I was jolted awake after who knows when, once I saw light shining down through the window. Fear gripped me, because I assumed it was that man coming back for me. He'd probably assumed I'd long since died and was coming to take my body away, or whatever it was he did with people he did this to. I tried to get up to my feet. Maybe I could try to trip him or something as he came through the door. However, I couldn't even bring myself to my knees, much less onto my feet. I just lay there weakly, listening as the door was unlocked. I heard footsteps on the upper floor. I had all these thoughts running through my head. Once he noticed I wasn't dead, he would probably just kill me himself. I wanted to be ready for something, but I didn't know what I could do. I'm not sure how long I heard walking around with the door opened. When a light shined down on me, I heard a woman's voice saying something, but I couldn't tell what it was. I passed out again and woke up next time in the hospital. My throat was extremely dry, and there was an IV in my arm. It turned out that the old house was for sale, and it was being showed. The agent was the one who opened the door and called the police and an ambulance when they saw me down there. I told the cops about the man, but there was no indication who he was. He was not the owner of the house, and as far as they knew, he never came back either. The police told me they figured he was just some sicko who wanted people to find dead bodies in their basement. I wasn't the first person they'd found in such a predicament. I was lucky that I managed to survive as long as I did. It was mostly because I was a minor. My parents were contacted, and they put me on a plane and brought me home. Interestingly enough, our problems we had seemed very minor once I got back home. I was one of those teenagers that hated just about everything that came from being a teenager. I hated living at home with my parents. I hated having to go to school. I hated trying to live under anyone's rules. When I was 16, I didn't exactly drop out of high school. However, I did just quit going altogether. It wasn't interesting to me anymore. When my parents got contacted about it, they told me I had to go to school. We got into a huge fight, and they told me that if I didn't go to school, then I couldn't live there anymore. I knew it was a bluff, but I really didn't care. I was fed up with living there anyway, so I contacted a few of my best friends. They were people who also hated living at home. My friend Carl had a car, and we decided to take what we had, load up the car, and go live our lives away from our families. We started driving west. We figured we'd drive through some of the mountain states, then head to California. It seemed like the best place for a runaway from home to go. We had at least a little bit of money. It was enough to keep us up with gas and keep us fed for a while. I was the first one to run out, though I didn't really ration it nearly as well as I should have. When you spend a lot of time with people in the car, especially if you've never been with them for a long time before, it can get somewhat testy. As well, I think the fact I didn't have any money made everyone sort of pissed off at me. While we were driving through the mountains in Colorado, we stopped to take a bathroom break. When I was done and zipping up, I heard the car start up. As I tried to run back to the area, I saw them all pulling away without me. I yelled, demanding for them to come back. One of the guys flipped me the bird as they drove off and left me behind. Now I really had no idea what to do, so I just walked along the side of the road. We were way up high in the mountains, and the altitude was already making me sick. A few cars went by me, and I tried hitching from them, but I guess most people don't want to pick up a lonely guy on the roadside. I had been hitching for several hours, and it was very dark now. Of course, when it got dark, the temperature fell accordingly, and I began to fear for my life. Finally, after hours and hours passed by, a car stopped to pick me up. I eagerly jumped in the passenger seat. The man who picked me up seemed pretty normal at first. He was a bigger guy, really fit. He looked like he worked out quite a lot. He was driving a luxury car with seat warmers, so I figured he must be decently well off too. He seemed really interested in helping me. It was after we had some normal small talk that he began asking me some more about myself. You know, why I was outside hiking in the mountains. I told him my friends had abandoned me when I ran out of money. I also told him I was 18 years old. I think he knew I was lying though. I barely even looked the 16 years I was. He got very interested in my story, why I had left with my friends to begin with. I was so thankful to have him pick me up, I just kept on answering all his questions without thinking. I didn't even harbor a thought he might have an ulterior motive. I slipped up and told him I'd left home because my parents and I weren't getting along. I don't think I was quite catching on that he was fishing for information. I just admitted I was a teenage runaway. Furthermore, a teenage runaway that no one knew where they were and might not possibly even care about. Then the conversation got much darker. The guy began telling me a story about the last time he'd picked up a hitchhiker. He made it seem like it was something he had done often. Told me it was another underage kid, making me realize he knew I was lying. I asked him what happened to the kid, and his response scared the crap out of me. Well, only I'll ever know. I tried to keep my fear hidden. I had so recently been grateful I'd been given a ride, but now I was terrified. I was trying to steer the talk back to this other hitchhiker, but he kept fishing around for more information about my home life. I was convinced I was going to end up a story this guy would tell another hitchhiker one day. I tried not to make it seem like I was afraid of him in any way. I asked him if we could stop at a rest area or something, because I badly had to go to the bathroom. He was unwilling to stop, so I began making my legs jump up a bit and pretended I needed to piss. He told me we'd stop at a gas station in about 15 minutes. When he brought the car to a stop, I told him I'd be back soon and ran out into the store. I immediately let the cashier know what was going on. I pointed to the car out by the pump. The man saw me talking to the clerk, and at that point he immediately pulled away and took off down the road at blazing speeds. That in my mind just confirmed what I already believed. I was done with my adventure now. I asked the clerk if I could use the phone, and I called my parents who were worried about me. They wired me the money to get home. Turns out I was actually the lucky one. My friends, when they were out of money, held up a gas station and got in much more trouble than I did. Funny how that works out in the end. Every now and then, you have to look back and wonder about things in your life, how it may have gone differently if we knew the results our actions would have. Everything might be so much better, choosing what actions would make the best outcomes, but instead everyone makes mistakes, and everyone suffers the consequences of those mistakes. I grew up in a fairly uncomfortable environment. My parents got divorced when I was really young. Us kids ended up being with our dad, not because he was a good parent or anything, but because he was the only one with a job and a place to live. He was quite substandard as a parent, actually. He got very lost in the alcohol. There was abuse, and he was bad at paying his bills as well. As a result, we ended up moving quite often. Whenever he'd neglected to pay rent for months on end, we'd have to move every time. We had no stability at all. When I was 15 years old, I met a boy named Todd, who was in a remarkably similar situation to me, only for him it was his mother. She was the worst parent. He lived with his brother, and the few times I was over at his house, I saw firsthand just how awful she was. We were both miserable, so one day when he was taking me for a ride in his Mustang, the song Fast Car by Tracy Chapman came on the radio. I guess we were both so miserable in our lives we decided to do it and just run away right then. We gathered some brief belongings and some money and decided we were gonna drive out to Chicago. I guess I could bog you down with the details. Hell, I could write a novel about it if I wanted to. All I can say is the trip was alright, and we did make it to Chicago in the end. However, we quickly learned that being able to find a job at 15 and 16 years old was a lot more difficult than it seemed. Also, his car was bought and paid for completely, but being 16 years old, it was not in his name. It was a present from his father, so it wasn't like his mother could report it stolen. The point being, we couldn't get any money for the car in any way. We had a hotel room at a really ratty hotel in the city, and after a few days of us not being able to pay for the room, Todd felt he had to do something in order to get us some money. One day he went out, and he was gone for a very long time. When he came back, he was visibly exhausted. I tried to get some information out of him, but he wouldn't tell me anything. He always changed the subject while we ate, then watched some television together. This continued for about a week and a half. Todd would go out during the day and come back looking completely worn down. He would always have food though, and a little bit of money as well, just enough to keep us going. One day, I told Todd we had some money to last us a few days, and he should take a day off from whatever it was he was doing. I'd go out and buy us some food instead. He was hard to convince, but eventually I did convince him to do it. He gave me some cash, and I went on my way. I was out of the hotel room for about 3 hours. I had to find a grocery store and get there, get the food, and come back. I felt really good about myself. I'd finally done something for Todd, who had done the world for me at that point. I came into the motel room, only to drop the groceries on the floor. Todd was laying in the bed. His throat had been cut completely open. His eyes stared blankly into nothingness, and there was blood all over the place. I ran down to call the hotel office and got them to call the police. It was a nightmare. I mean, an absolute nightmare. I couldn't believe what just happened. Just a few hours beforehand, I had been feeling on top of the world, thinking I could let my best friend rest well. I tried to do something nice for him, and in that short period of time, he was brutally murdered in the room I'd slept with him in all along. I was sent back home to my dad. Todd's parents were called soon after. There was an investigation, of course, but the case is cold, and Todd has been left with no trail. As to what sort of job he was doing to get that money, the only person who knew him in the city was me, and I didn't know anything. Todd was a teenage runaway, whose death got lost in the annals of teenage runaways. I always assumed whatever he was doing for money, it must have been something illegal. I wonder if I'd stayed home that night, would he still be alive? But I have a feeling we'd both be dead instead. I feel responsible for my friend being murdered. I don't have any answers to these questions, but I spent my life being an advocate for resources for teens who run away from home. I hope that maybe some teenagers hearing this story will decide against running away. Your life may be miserable now, but it can get a whole lot worse. If you do run away, go to a shelter. Don't do anything illegal. The world's a lot scarier than you think it is, I promise you. I miss you, Todd, and that's all I can say to you. That plus, I'm sorry. My SO and I had a big fight, and I decided to leave the party we were at. It was only about 9 p.m., and I was crying, so I wanted to go home. Rather than go with everyone else to the bar crawl, I hailed a cab, got in, and gave him the address. The directions only needed 3 turns to get home. I then started text arguing on my phone, still crying. I was too engrossed in the argument though, and realized too late that he had taken a left 2 streets earlier than he was supposed to. My phone was kind of messed up, so even though it said it still had battery, it just suddenly went black and wouldn't turn on anymore. I looked up and noticed we were not on the right track. "Hey, wait, where are we?" At that point, the guy started speeding like crazy, going towards the highway. I started screaming, but he was not even reacting to me. Before he turned onto the highway, he had to slow down by a light though. I frantically tried to open my door to bail, only to realize it was child-locked. He ended up going 90 miles per hour down a 2-lane road, then turning into a dark alley behind a small empty office building. He reached back and grabbed me and tried to pull me towards him. This part is a little bit blurry. I remember frantically twisting my body, so much so that he lost his grip and my head was by the passenger side window. I knocked open the door with my head and tumbled out into the gravel and glass. I got up and started running. Only problem was, I was in the middle of nowhere. There were no street lights, no cars to flag down for help. I made a swift judgment call and ran towards the office building. I found a hiding place inside, and I could hear him walking around and yelling, "Hey, I'm sorry, I won't try anything. Just come back to the car and I'll drive you home for real, free of charge. There's nothing out here, I promise. You'll be out here all night, just get back in the car." He went back to his car and slowly drove around in a circle, clearly searching for me. When I saw his car pull out and start off down the street again, I waited for a couple more minutes, then ran as fast as I could until I came upon a tiny hole-in-the-wall biker saloon. Obviously, I was bawling my eyes out, saying I needed to go inside and use their phone to call the cops. The bouncer wouldn't let me in because I didn't have my ID. I'd left my purse in the cab, unfortunately. I pled with them, but I guess they didn't believe my story. 2 guys parked out front started creepily catcalling me. I freaked and started running again, trying to find someone who would help me. I ended up stumbling upon a closed Walgreens at an intersection. That's when I realized my dead phone was still in my pocket. I tried to turn it back on, and after multiple tries, it finally worked. I called 911 and gave them my location. They said they were on the way, and then the phone went black and dead once again. I waited for about 45 minutes, but no one arrived. Panicking, I tried again. I had to finagle my phone for a long time, but eventually it worked, and I called my SO. No answer. I called his roommate who picked up, and as quickly as I could while choking on tears, told him where I was, and he needed to come get me immediately. He did so, thank God. I got in the car and we called 911 together. The police said they would meet us at his apartment. After 2 hours, we called again. They said they would be there in half an hour, but they never came. I went to the station the next morning to report it. That's not where the story ends though. A couple days later, I get a call from my apartment complex saying, "Hey, we have your purse at the office, come by and get it." I almost fainted. How? I talked to the office staff, who said the people at my old apartment had turned it in for me. We'd recently moved away from that 1-bedroom to a new 2-bedroom. I went to my old apartment and knocked on the door. The couple living there said a guy matching the cab driver's description had started banging on their door and yelling late last night. It's not the best area of town, so the husband opened the door with his gun drawn and asked the man what the hell he was doing. He stuttered something about returning my purse. The husband had a bad vibe though, and made him fork it up with his gun and leave. He drove away in his cab after. The wife wrote down the cab info that she could see from under the street lamp. I can't imagine what would have happened if he still lived there. I'm so glad the couple was well protected. I work as a nanny, and after telling my employer about this, she was horrified. She told me I needed to look at something. She's a lawyer, and her firm had been working on compiling a case against that same cab company for hiring multiple people with violent criminal records. A couple of weeks later, with her help and the information from that couple, my attacker was caught. To this day, there's so many what-ifs that terrify me. What if I didn't get away? What if he had just turned around and come back down the street? What if I'd actually changed the address on my license when I properly should have? I'm very thankful everything lined up for me to get away.